clear up something in the beginning. People always ask me, where did you get your degree in theology? I don't have a degree in theology. As I answer most of them, I'm just a sinner who was a practicing physician for 35 years in an academic institution, and then for 15 years was the head of all of the research, education, and clinical practice at the University of Minnesota Health System, which is a huge health system. And I'm going to give you my observations on the problem that I call Crisis in the Core Family and Time for Orthodox Leadership. So this is an overview of this talk. The core family used to be the dominant mode of cultural and social engagement. That is no longer true. It is the minority mode of operating now. And this erosion has consequences, and Orthodoxy needs to be engaged in addressing this erosion and its consequences. This commentary provides my observations on what is occurring and why it's occurring, and then some ideas about how Orthodoxy can address it. I think underneath this, it took time for this crisis to develop, and it will take time to change its course. So this is a couple of slides on the what. What are we talking about? The first piece of this is marriage. There's a huge change worldwide now in the change in the definition of marriage. Who gets married, how they get married. There's a whole lot of data coming out now of the decline in intimacy in relationships, particularly those between 15 and 35 years old. There's a reduction in the rate of marriage, there's a delay in the age of getting marriage, there's an increase in secular marriages, and there's an increase, a marked increase actually, in single parenting. The second phenomenon is the gap that has occurred between the educated and affluent and the non-affluent and disadvantaged. People with an advanced education, basically the data is around baccalaureate degrees, they tend to get married later and have fewer children. There's a widening gap in wealth worldwide and socioeconomic status between the upper 10% and the lower 90%, which is becoming a real problem. And there's a continuing widening of the gap in the social determinants of health, wellness, and opportunity. In the USA in 2017, so-called unstable homes cost 111 billion US dollars over 20 years that it has been measured. 34 billion was in child cost, 77 billion was in maternal costs. There's a progressive rise in homelessness. And if you travel around in the major cities, you will see it. There's a progressive rise in addiction rates, mortality, and joblessness. And by addiction here, I'm using a broad definition. Could be drugs, could be all other kinds of addiction that you can think of. And there's increasing secularism and the rise of the nones, which I'll explain in a minute, and a decline in worship. The progressive cultural transition, I'm going to talk a few slides now about why do I think this has occurred. The observation is there's a progressive cultural transition from the we, us, to the I, and what's in it for me approach to relationships, both on an individual level and on a collective level. There's generational shift, and I'm talking here about those less than 30 years old, in values away from religion and God. And these groups are looking for a spirituality that supports their own beliefs as they see their beliefs from their life observations. This is a big problem. There's progressive growth of capitalism with a bottom line orientation. This is globalism, the internet platforms, and the worldwide conversations. And there's this progressive emphasis on materialism with the rise of two-career families, starting in the USA in about 1970 and worsening in subsequent recessions, the last of which was 2008. There's a decline in engagement in religion and worship. I just finished reading again Father Schmemann's book, For the Life of the World, which is all about secularism defined as a lack of worship. And you just see it all over the place. There's a significant decline in engagement in Orthodoxy in all jurisdictions in North America. The North American Council of Canonical Bishops looked at the number of practicing Orthodox, defined as going to church at least once a year, about 3 or 4 years ago, and there were 1.3 million practicing Orthodox by that definition. They just completed a repeat of that survey, and there are now 850 plus minus 1,000. And that's in about 4 years. There's a significant decline in youth engagement in Orthodoxy in North America. Trying to get the youth to enter church and come and see the liturgy is a big problem. And the rise of the nuns. Do you know what the nuns are? This may be an American phenomenon. When you fill out an application for a job, they generally ask you your religious affiliation, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and then there's a box for none. 25% of people in North America now mark the box none. This is a startling new development, and the reason they give you is organized religion, God, just doesn't help me in my daily life. And I view that as the church's problem as much as the person's problem. Economic reality and the social determinants of well-being and opportunity are a major why. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The poor have the challenges of rent, food, utilities, transportation, affordable health care, and they spend their time worrying about that and ask the question, how does God help me with that? Homelessness, we talked about. Even university students, about 1/3 of them right now worry about the cost of education and where they're going to sleep and where they're going to get their food. At the University of Minnesota, we've opened up support for places to stay, and we actually give a significant percentage of the student population in the undergraduate programs access to food. This is not just at us, this is in all major, primarily public universities across the country. Mental health support is getting to be a big problem. At our student health service now, we have more mental health practitioners than we do primary care physicians and nurses. This is not uncharacteristic of American public universities and private universities. There's a rise of nationalism and its budgetary allocations. What do I mean by that? I promised myself I would not mention the word Trump, so I'm not going to. But the rise of nationalism worldwide and boundaries and immigration are real problems, and the result in budgeting allocations away from services for the disadvantages. And where did that money go? Generally to the militaries and stuff like that. And that is a worldwide problem that is just there. This is what I believe. Orthodoxy at all levels of jurisdiction, hierarchy, clergy, and laity, we have a duty and an obligation to engage in this crisis and change its direction, its trajectory. It's time for leadership in Orthodoxy. Here's some ideas about that. I grew up in this, and these are my observations. I think we need to end one-way communication, top down, and engage in the process of learning so that both clergy and laity and hierarchs learn how to dialogue with each other and learn from each other about what's important. We have to engage youth so that orthodoxy is meaningful in their lives and aids discernment, critical thinking, and decision-making. Now, one of the things we've wrestled with in the seminary at St. Vladimir's is the generational characteristics of people who are coming through into higher education in one form or another. And it's critical to understand that generations are not the same. They have different values and they have different ways of doing business. So it requires an understanding of generational characteristics, particularly for how they engage in communication and dialogue. And if we are to affect the decision-making and critical thinking that goes into discernment of daily choices of living, we really need to understand this and deal with it and work with it at all levels. I believe seminaries need to engage more in pastoral experiential learning. What do I mean by that? The learning that goes on that's necessary for the skill development for a parish and all of the problems that occur in parishes, and they're all there, all you got to do is look for them, requires experiential education in the parish with priests who are working with that parish. You need to be involved in the problems of life. I don't care what it is, whether it's some kind of addiction, some kind of problem in a marriage. If you don't have that experience, the theory doesn't become practice. And that's been my role in life, is practice, bringing theory into practice, bringing science into practice, bringing practice into reality. And it's important that we provide the formative knowledge, attitudes, and skills in understanding and engaging this crisis. So we need to address it at all levels, hierarchs down to parish priests, deacons, subdeacons, and laity. This is an issue of congregations. It's an issue of the body of Christ. And we need to deal with it at that level, in my opinion. I believe laity, particularly professionals, need to engage in developing experiential opportunities and materials to engage youth. We usually don't do that. We rely on materials that come from somewhere, as opposed to knowledgeable laity who are psychologists or psychiatrists or practitioners of one form of professionalism or another who can work with clergy to develop materials. And I'll show you some of that that's beginning to happen. We have to learn about interdisciplinary teams and their role in changing the direction of the crisis. In healthcare, this is becoming the norm very rapidly. It's just too complicated to take care of a complex patient by a single practitioner. The more complicated the problem is, the more it requires a team to address of interdisciplinary activities and professions. And I believe we need to view the core family as a team. I have not seen this. I certainly did not grow up in a team environment with an Italian background. It's a very different vertical kind of system, and that doesn't fly in today's genre. It needs to be more horizontal and horizontal integration. We need to approach parishes and communities in a team environment. Church councils need to work as a team with the pastor of the parish to understand and work with the issues that are in that parish and the people in that parish. And we need to restore us to the equation and move away from I and what's in it from me. Learning what leadership is important. What's also important is learning what it is not. And I'll say a few words about that in a minute. I have two final thoughts. The Orthodox liturgy is the glue of orthodoxy. That's my words. What does that mean? Christ, period. And yet, how do we get today's youth into the church to experience the liturgy? I'm actually a convert from Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And when I was in medical school, one of my student partners took me to a Syrian Orthodox church, said, come and see. I never went back to the Roman church. I was so overwhelmed because all of my senses were taken in by the liturgy, and I began to progressively understand what that's about and how that is Christ in action in salvation. And that is not understood by today's youth. That's our problem. We're not communicating with them to make that happen. So how do we individually and collectively achieve the goals of orthodoxy, being meaningful excuse me, in people's lives, and in aiding discernment, critical thinking, and decision making? That's what education is about. And we need to do a better job of that. My last final thought is, it took time for this crisis to develop. It's going to take time to change its direction. We must begin. There are some signs that are happening. These are just several I pointed out. The Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the United States of America has put out Go and Make Disciplines, Evangelization and Outreach in U.S. Orthodoxy. They have looked at successful parishes that are attracting youth, that are vibrant communities of spirituality and religiosity, and what those characteristics are, and what's not happening in parishes that are declining in enrollment, and so on and so forth. This is a good read. Faith Tree, which is an Antiochian effort, actually by Charles Agelot's niece?
I think so.
I think it's his niece. This is a group of interprofessionals, communicators, psychologists, priests, knowledgeable laity, who are putting together materials that they test for the ability to communicate with the different genres of youth. And they are very successful at what they're doing. The knowledge is transmitted and retained. They're called Faith Tree. That's their URL there, faithtreeresources.org. And then there's a new effort that's starting up. It's called the Orthodox Leadership Institute. First board meeting is at the end of January, which is really the first attempt to really bring leadership to the laity and the priesthood, about what leadership is and what it is not. Well, this is an academic group. I come from an academic background, so there's got to be references and materials you can read. This is stuff that's worth reading. It's all available online. I will leave this with IOTA, or you can email me and I will send it to you. These are easy access and good, basic information, like the National Census information, real information that supports this kind of reasoning that I've tried to give you and summarize in my observation. Well, that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening.